Everyone thinks that's the nuclear weapon. They think it's a nuclear weapon. They say if I press this, it's the end of the world.
Oh. And then there's like
and it doesn't seem to work out that
50
way.
Welcome to the Magnificast, a podcast about Christianity, leftist politics. I'm your co-host, Matt Bernico.
And I'm your other co-host, Dean Deloff.
Have you heard about this? Have you heard about this thing? This is my Jay Leno impression. On Fox News the other day, Megyn Kelly was going around the Oval Office. Donald Trump showed her a very special button on his desk.
I did see this.
Thank God. Well, I'm going to talk about it right now on this podcast. So he says to Megyn Kelly, oh, yeah, people think this is the nuclear bomb button. Press this button and there's nuclear bombs. But guess what? This button just brings him a Coke. This is the Coke button on his desk.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
What do you think about this, Dean? What do you think about this Coke button?
Okay, first of all, I think the Coke button... so Biden famously did remove the Coke button from the Oval Office, which I think is actually very funny that Trump left it there. One of Biden's very few extremely important reforms was to remove the Coke button, and it's back. Trump has taken his revenge. I think the Coke button is fine. We should all have such a button in our homes. But I think the thing that I find mostly troubling about it is that he does make a joke about how people walk into the office and think that it's the button for the nuclear bombs, like the nuclear arsenal. And that is something I find genuinely unsettling.
Hang on. I find it unsettling too, maybe for different reasons. Before we talk about why it's unsettling, Can we also talk about how it is like a wooden box that has a little plastic button on it?
Yeah.
Like,
yep.
Do you remember? I don't know if hang on. We'll get back to unsettling nuclear bombs in just one moment. But there was a time in the not too distant past where Amazon would sell these buttons where you could just press the button and it would like order you another thing of toilet paper. But this is so different. This is like a fancy wooden box, and then somebody brings him a Coke. It's just absolutely bonkers. I mean, I wish I had a little box and a button that someone would bring me a LaCroix or something. But I feel like just a Diet Coke is so shameful. Anyways, Dean, you were saying something about nuclear bombs that seemed important.
Yeah, that's right. I was. Well, I was wondering how you were going to make the connection here to the topic we just to discuss, which is nuclear bombs, famously lively, lighthearted subject for a podcast. And I'm glad that you chose this way in, Matt, because I think it does kind of just create maybe a more helpful scene for us to talk about what's at stake. The guy who does have the Diet Coke button in the Oval Office is also the guy who, in theory, could have his finger on the button of the nuclear arsenal, assuming there is a button. I actually have no idea. That's just a thing that people say on TV, and I guess I believe them. It's probably more complicated than that, but I just want to say I appreciate you giving us a nice kind of soft entry into this topic.
I'm so mad and crabby about both of these things, not equally so, but I'm just annoyed. I'm annoyed that the Coke button exists, and I'm loathsome about the nuclear bomb buttons existing. I hope they're not close to each other. I hope that he would never confuse them. But with this guy, who can say with this big orange guy, this big orange Cheeto in the White House?
Okay, I've looked it up just so you know, and the nuclear button is not technically real, but also it is kind of less complicated than I would have hoped. Anyway, it's neither here nor there. There's a lot of nuclear briefcases and stuff. We've all seen those movies. That's fine. But I do think it is kind of, this was like a big talking point among liberals during both the first campaign and Trump's second campaign, where they were like, is this the kind of person that you want to have his finger on the nuclear button? Or, just to say, like, this is a person who probably shouldn't exercise irrational control over the ability to blow up the whole planet. And while I think that liberal kind of messaging is absurd, the reason I think it is absurd isn't so much because I think that someone else should have their finger on the nuclear button, but the fact that we sort of take for granted that we have so many nuclear bombs in the first place. And that, I think, is something we should probably talk about.
Yeah, big time, man. I have some thoughts about these nuclear bombs and the state of deterrence. This is going to be a podcast where we talk about nuclear proliferation, French philosophy, Christian responses to violence, and probably a few other things, but at least those extremely bizarre constellations of things. International relations. We'll get some of that in there too. Speaking of international relations, Dean, you might have heard this. Donald Trump, he's in the White House. That'd be weird if you didn't know it after we just had that conversation. That being the case, all kinds of global patterns and norms of international security have begun to shift in a big way. So, since the end of World War II, the U.S. and its massive nuclear arsenal, which has 5,244 nuclear weapons, it seems like that's too many.
Too
Like,
many.
Why? In what world would you need that many? Like, from a completely sort of like the darkest place my brain can imagine, like that is just unnecessary, I guess is what I'm trying to say. It's too many. It's far too many. The United States, since World War II, has been basically like creating a nuclear umbrella for Europe. Trump's second term has thrown a little bit of that arrangement into question, and it's now less clear whether or not the U.S. will provide a backstop against threats to Europe, like the war in Ukraine and so on. People in Europe are taking notice of these these changes, these shifts in the norm. So this has led a lot of European countries like France, Germany, and Poland to start having like what they call strategic conversations about so-called nuclear sharing, which are some very funny spins on branding about, again, what is the darkest thing I can imagine.
Could I just borrow your massive killing machine for a minute?
Oh, these bombs that I have? Yeah, we'll just all hold on to them together, I guess. It seems crazy. But basically the idea is, in case you're unaware of this whole thing, is that if the U.S. is no longer guaranteeing the protection and defense of like NATO countries, then those countries will have to fill the gaps themselves through other arrangements. In Europe, not every country has nuclear weapons, but some of them do. Like UK and France, they both have nuclear weapons. And, countries like Poland are now considering like, well, who's got our back? If the sands are shifting, if the wind is blowing in a different direction, who is going to make sure nuclearly that nobody gets us, or that there would be retribution or whatever? For example, Poland's Prime Minister Donald Tusk. There's too many Donalds in the world. I don't like that there's another guy. Another DT out there. That's not great. But anyways, Poland's Prime Minister Donald Tusk in the last few weeks has urged more government spending in Poland on defense. Poland already spends quite a bit of money on defense, but they are suggesting that maybe they should investigate nuclear options. And that might mean opening the doors to U.S. nuclear weapons like on their soil. Sometimes that happens where a country will like say that they are okay with having another country's nuclear weapons on their soil, like for strategic reasons. Like, for example, Italy has 35 U.S. nuclear weapons in Italy for, reasons. But they themselves don't have like nuclear weapons. Like the Italian military doesn't have nuclear weapons themselves. So an interesting distinction. Anyway, so countries like Poland are interested in like maybe getting some of those not the Diet Cokes, not the Diet Coke button, but the nuclear button from the United States. But anyways,
They could get both.
There's no rule that says you can't have the Coke button and the nuclear button. That's a great point. I think all of this is bad. Nuclear proliferation is bad. More nuclear weapons in the world are bad. More countries with them are bad. And I think if there's even one nuclear bomb remaining, it's bad. And I would say that at least some Christians agree with me. Christians have always been pretty consistent interveners in anti-nuclear and peace activism. We'll talk about the Pelagios movement here in a bit and some other odds and ends of Christian activism and thought around nuclear weapons. Given that like Christians have, been in this conversation historically, I think it makes sense to maybe revisit some of those ideas as tensions continue to ratchet up. And there's more like space for conversations about nuclear sharing and stuff like that. It's a moment in history where it's worth doubling down on not just the Christian values of like peace or something like vaguely, but being specifically against nuclear weapons and thinking about what it means to sort of, continue that tradition of Christian social movements against nuclear weapons and how to like articulate that in 2025, the year of our Lord.
Yeah, and I think that it's also kind of interesting to think through what nuclear weapons mean and what they say about human society, what they say about capitalism and all of that. And we'll get to that, I guess, in a minute. at the top of it, I mean, I don't think we have to go through why nukes are bad so much. Probably if you listen to this podcast, you already think that. I would hope so to some degree or another.
It's because mass death is bad. That's it.
They're bad. Episode over. But I think that, like, even in terms of the kind of sheer excess of them, what they say about, you know, society at large in the 21st century even is really fascinating. You know, the 20th century is often remembered by historians, and I think about people like the Marxist historian Eric Hobsbawm as, like, the century that invented, like, industrialized mass death. That's kind of the invention of the 20th century. And in large part, you can tell the story of that 100 years as like a, you know, a ratcheting up of kind of the means of just like wanton violence. And what I think is fascinating about the 21st century, and also really hard to live through, is that we, you know, like at the end of the last century, there was this assumption that the Cold War was over and the 90s would kind of inaugurate this like beautiful future for liberal capitalism. And now, you know, for my entire lifetime, for example, that has been a failure. That has not been the case. And all the kinds of tensions that capitalism and geopolitics produce are still with us. And we don't have these kind of like countervailing, you know, political forces or political ideas realized as heavily as maybe in the 20th century. And I think what I find really troubling is like all the inheritance of that kind of means of death that we've gotten from the 20th century in the 21st just feels like it will get weirder and weirder in the 21st century with things like climate change and, you know, shifting sovereignty and shifting economic relationships and so on. And I was just thinking about how like the US has over 5,000 nuclear weapons. And it's one of those great questions of being like, at what point did someone kind of say, you know, I think we don't have enough. Like, people had to just constantly rubber stamp that, you know, it had to be a constant part of the military budget. It had to be a kind of regular piece of, I don't know, discussion among military leaders and so on, such that they agreed so many times that we needed more, that we had over 5,000. And going into this century with that kind of arsenal is just a really sort of spooky thing. And I mean, we'll talk about Paul Virilio in a second, a French philosopher that we're obligated to discuss whenever we talk about war. But I think the basic point he has is right, that there is a kind of like logic of war making that once you're in it, it is like super hard to get out of it. And I think the challenge for people in this century is going to be to figure out how to eject ourselves from that trajectory, because otherwise we are going to get blown up by it.
Speaking of getting blown up by it, we've said a handful of things about nuclear weapons. Let me tell you some stats about them. Maybe, I don't know, so you can say that you listened to a podcast and you learned something. I don't know. I don't know what other reason why. There are 9 countries that currently have nuclear weapons. The United States, obviously one of them. They've got the United States does not have the most, surprisingly to me. Russia does. They have several hundred more than the United States. And then the other countries that do have nuclear weapons, like independently of their own sort of sovereign state, are China, France, UK, Pakistan, India, Israel, and the DPRK. So that's interesting. It's those 9 countries, and you'd think that would be the end of it. But there are also 6 other countries who host nuclear weapons. So these are countries that do not themselves like produce nuclear weapons, but they're just kind of like they're sharing them in a sort of friendly, diplomatic way. And those countries are Italy, which has 35 U.S. nuclear weapons, Belarus, which has Russian nuclear weapons, Belgium, Germany, Netherlands, and Turkey all have U.S. nuclear weapons in them as well. But there's some interesting asides about all of these countries. Like, for example, Germany, in their constitution, there is like a blurb, a constitutional blurb about how they are specifically like going to be a country that does not create nuclear weapons, not build them, but like they will just slide, you know, they got some in their back pocket in case they ever need them, you know. not that like Germany could launch them without the U.S. giving the thumbs up or whatever. Like it's not that situation, but it's that they are there. They're there on Germany's, I don't know, grounds. It's such a weird thing to think about that like basically, I mean, like Russia for sure, right? Russia aside, but a huge world superpower like the United States can just kind of like put these huge, big bombs on in other countries, which okay, like that's crazy. That's a crazy thing, if especially when you're thinking about big questions of like sovereignty, but also um, having nuclear weapons in your country. We usually think about that as protection and deterrence, but it also makes your country like a target for other people who have nuclear weapons. So I don't know. It seems like a big risk to me. If I was the president of Italy, I would say we gotta get these big bombs out of here.
Yeah, I agree, and I'll vote for you in the Italian election when it comes up.
Thank you. No, I appreciate that.
Yeah, and I think too the kind of the questions around things like deterrence or proliferation and so on are good philosophical questions. And the ostensible logic of having nukes is that it deters people from attacking you. And I guess historically so far people have not launched them at each other except for in Japan. But that to me doesn't seem like a very stable argument to make because it really only takes one person to mess that up and you have a big problem in your hands.
One of the arguments against proliferation, this is just like an idea, one argument amongst many, is that if you have nuclear weapons deployed in all these other countries, you can't safeguard them in the same way that you would if they were even in your own country. So, nuclear weapons in Italy or in Belgium mean that that's like one more place that somebody could try to snatch them from or steal them from or whatever, or all kinds of other sort of Tom Clancy-esque escalations that we can imagine in the world. But yeah, I don't know, it's just like it's not safe. It's not a safe thing for the populations of those countries is all I'm trying to say. And it's bad.
I agree. It's bad. It's bad. And guess what? We're not the first Christians to say that. And I think, one reason we wanted to talk about nuclear weapons on this episode of a podcast about Christianity and the left is, we've been talking kind of off the show here and there about how there's a huge need to rebuild a lot of movements that have been lost, whether it's movements for international solidarity or even like church networks around liberation theology and so on. But one of those big movements is the peace movement. And it used to be the case, like in the Vietnam War, for example, at least in the global north, that the peace movement was pretty big, pretty bold, very radical, capable of exploring a variety of tactics to end a war. And as people who've lived through the war on terror and the war in Iraq and the war in a bunch of other places, some more public than others, I think it's pretty evident that the peace movement has basically fizzled out. It's not that people aren't doing anything. There are some really impressive anti-war activists out there, and they're really great. But en masse, the kind of peace consciousness that maybe used to motivate a lot of people is gone. And I think one thing that is really impressive about Christianity in the West is that even though Christians are the ones who invented and used nuclear weapons on Japan, that's a hot take I'll say on this podcast. That was a Christian choice, and so much the worse for all of us. At the same time, Christians have opposed that since they've been used. There's been a huge anti-war and anti-nuclear movement among Christians for a long time, which we'll talk about in a minute. But I think that as we go into this kind of, this century with wars and rumors of wars and all that kind of stuff, it's good to start thinking through, like, what are the kind of Christian signposts in the past who have been trying to raise a prophetic voice against nuclear weapons and other kinds of military armament, and how do we, carry those forward into the 21st century? So we're not only carrying the weapons, but we're also carrying the resistance to them.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. I guess I want to make one provision really quickly about, you mentioned that the anti-war movement, the peace movement, however we want to frame what it's called, I guess, has kind of fizzled out. And I think that's true in a qualitatively important way. I also would suggest, though, that like some of that still does live on in like the Palestinian solidarity movement and things like that. Like it exists. It isn't. But what we're saying is that it is not the same. It is not as like beefy as it might have been during the Vietnam War or something like that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, for sure. People are always doing stuff. That's a really important thing.
They should keep on doing it.
Yeah, they should keep on doing it. And people are always doing stuff, not in a way that like it's like, oh, they're just looking busy. People are doing very good stuff. But, there just isn't the kind of scale at this stage around peace that there used to be. I will say, I think the Palestinian movement has been a big boost for rethinking some of that stuff. There's been a lot of focus on armaments and arms trades, and like even in a country like Canada, the Canadian Parliament was basically forced to talk through how it's arming Israel and how it's a party to creating violence and so on through supply chains and things like that. So I think that it's true that, in one way, the peace movement is kind of always irreducibly connected to all these other things, especially international solidarity. But we don't have a mass movement of people like defecting and encouraging people to drop out, and also preparing the kind of ground that we would need to receive all that as well. So I think that's a big key.
Like we mentioned a minute ago, there is a big and interesting Christian history to rejecting war. We're talking about like pacifism a lot here, for sure. But I think it kind of goes beyond like what you might call pacifism in some ways. Not in a negative, violent way, just in a very like active way. Pacifism and not passive at all. People actually like sort of actively engaging with the existing sort of like military structures and trying to intervene in them in non-violent ways. We usually group all of these kinds of things together in just with the title the Plowshare Movement. But there's all kinds of specific groups and movements within it. Different groups of people broke into military facilities and got arrested. The Cantonville Nine, for example, which the Berrigan brothers took part in, or different groups going into different military bases. Bill Wiley Kellerman from G's Magazine was involved with them as well, and there's a lot of Christians kind of doing that work. I don't know, Dean, what should we point out specifically about plowshares?
Yeah, I mean, I think, as you say, it's a diverse and kind of long-running thing, and also something that's not, like, gone either. Most recently in, I think, 2018, there was the Kings Bay Plowshares group, which was 7 Catholic activists who broke into the Kings Bay Naval Base, which has a bunch of, what do you call them? Submarines. That's what they're called. Sort of underwater boats, if you will. Submarines that are able to carry nuclear weapons, nuclear missiles. So they broke into that naval base. They did a big action related to anti-war, but also anti-racism and all kinds of stuff. And they got arrested and went on trial. They were all found guilty. And big complicated stuff. So just to kind of affirm, like, that is very recent. So it's not like these people are gone. But I think it's a really unique and interesting and very, like, powerful movement of solidarity. It often kind of relies on like creating a spectacle on purpose. So like, you have like the point is not to like sabotage and then like run away, but in fact to sabotage and be caught in many cases, or to like run away and eventually be caught, like Daniel Berrigan, for example, who famously fled the FBI until he was caught. And some of these kind of spectacles will include things like doing a prayer service on a military base, or, most famously, some activists have like spilled their own blood or the blood of others or whatever on nuclear warheads and other means of war to kind of show that, it's a powerful kind of weapon capable of spilling blood. And there's also a sort of sacramental element in that choice. And I think, we've talked about the Plowshares movement on this show, like, probably years ago now. And I don't know what we said, but I think probably something I wouldn't agree with now. But I think sometimes we, like, on the show, we sometimes criticize propaganda of the deed, where it's like, if you just do something wild, then society will change. And I still think that is not sufficient. But the challenge that the Plowshares movement gives to us in general, us largely like society, but especially people on the left, is to say, like, what is the kind of movement that, sort of agrees with that ostensibly, that you shouldn't have a ton of nuclear weapons and is capable of organizing against them. So it's a kind of like theatrical, spectacular form of protest historically, and it tends to come out of a certain Christian imaginary in ways that I think are really impressive.
Yeah, exactly. So, like, for example, Bill Wiley Kellerman, part of the Plowshares movement, he has a piece in G's, a past G's magazine that no longer exists, RIP, where he kind of tells the story about doing the Eucharist at a military base over a nuclear bomb, and they like splash blood on it. But it's a whole interesting thing. But yeah, using the sort of symbolic power of liturgy to sort of paint a fuller picture of like what this actually means and why they're doing it. And yeah, quite an interesting and like stark statement.
I also think there's something different here about, like we did an episode on how to blow up a pipeline, that movie, a while back, and it was a crabby episode. I didn't like it. I didn't like the movie, and in part because there's a lot of like immaturity, I think, in the political vision behind a film like that in particular, where the idea, for folks who don't know, it's like all these activists, they get together, they blow up a pipeline, and then there's kind of an assumption that that will kick off like a cascade of direct action and sabotage for climate change. And for a lot of reasons, I think that is very silly and not helpful. But I think there's something actually different going on in these sorts of direct actions, because the kind of moral vision that it casts on purpose is really powerful and really persuasive. And like you can read the trial transcripts of a lot of these people, and they're like such a kind of, I don't know, like morally courageous set of people who are willing to say things in court to judges and so on that, I don't know, makes me feel like I should be a more courageous person in my life. And yeah. I think, as you said, Matt, there's a kind of like, there's a sense that, I'm not going to go do that myself. I'll just say on this podcast, I'm saying that for the FBI person to sign to listen to our podcast. Right. I'm not going to go to a military base and put my blood on anything. But what I think is important is to be like, what is the sort of movement that does need to exist such that these kinds of symbolic actions are more than just symbolic, that they can actually be like manifested in a kind of people power that goes beyond, some kind of isolated, important, beautiful, radical moments.
Yeah, I think that makes sense, right? Some of the Plowshares, like spectacular moments, they're cool, they're interesting, they're provocative. I think they do what they set out to do, and like you said, that they maybe are a bit more mature than I don't know, than the movie How to Blow Up a Pipeline, which is probably an easy target to hit. But yeah, it kind of makes you think about like the structure of a movement and like how does something have to look or act or be organized to actually get to a point where those types of movement, like that type of activity, could be supported in a sufficient way. Because like you mentioned, like the Kings Bay Plowshare people are in jail, and like there's a handful of people who know about that and who probably visit them and like write them letters and stuff, but they're not getting like the same kind of support that like maybe the Berrigans would have or something like that in a more like radical during a more radical time. But yeah, I don't know. It just makes you think that like what would it look like to make a form of Christianity, a Christian network, a Christian organization, a movement, whatever you'd want to call it, that would actually be there to like support that type of action in the world. Or, maybe if there was that kind of social movement, that type of action wouldn't really even be necessary. I don't know. But yeah, it makes you think. There's a bigger sort of picture that comes with some of the Plowshare stuff that people don't often consider. And I think that's too bad. Because it's like the Plowshare stuff is cool and courageous and interesting. And like, it's the kind of thing that you read about and you think like, wow, these people are really living out their convictions. But I think it's hard to really live out those convictions without like the rest of the support structure, to be honest.
Yeah, I think that's right. And even on top of that too, like the distribution of sentences for the Kings Bay Plowshares is complicated. Like some of them are out and got out, and I think some of them are still incarcerated. I don't know. We should have looked that up before we did this episode. But all that to say, like like you said, there's this is like a pretty huge thing to like put your freedom on the line, and for like the sake of the entire planet, and then to sort of just be like left to the network of folks that already know you, maybe, rather than kind of having a movement that can amplify that sort of thing, I think is just again a big challenge to the rest of us to be like, what's the peace movement we can build that can I don't know, deliver on these kinds of actions when people do take the courage to open up a space. Speaking of moral authorities, I think it might help too to just get a couple of other people on the board here, and then we can maybe talk through nuclear weapons in a in a more philosophical way, a much more useless way, but a way that maybe we're better at doing. One person that I also often think about as a kind of like strong voice against nuclear weapons is a bishop Raymond Hunthausen. He was the Bishop of Seattle for a while, from 75 to 1991. And he was a really radical anti-nuclear voice. He pushed the conversation pretty heavily. He was famously an enemy of Ronald Reagan in particular, a thorn in his side, which I think is really impressive. Penny Lerneau wrote this book called People of God, which we've referenced on the show about liberation theology before. But she talks a lot about Hunthausen in there as well, and kind of the hot water that he got in with the Vatican, in addition to Reagan and other kinds of people. And he was a really remarkable guy. He died not too long ago, but had a long life. But what I think is cool about him is that as a bishop in particular, and the bishop of a city, he really embraced that kind of voice of moral authority and moral courage in a way that I think is really challenging to people who find themselves in similar occupations, whether it's pastors or priests or bishops. And it also kind of like shows how rare, unfortunately rare, such a voice is. That, it should be the case that there are like dozens of bishops in a place like the United States, which has the most nuclear weapons than anywhere else, who are like known anti-nuclear activists, but it's not the case. So just to say, I think that like as we sort of build this like group of touch points or touchstones or people or whatever who show a different way of engaging this stuff, it's just helpful to like amass those kinds of voices and be like, who is out there putting their career on the line. And I guess the connection too is that Hunthausen ultimately did suffer for that kind of stance and that sort of public ministry. He was eventually removed from his diocese and kind of marginalized within the church for lots of reasons, but certainly that is definitely one of them, I think. Well, let's turn to something that we're better equipped to talk about than any of this stuff, which is weird European philosophy. So we mentioned Paul Virilio earlier, a guy who shows up haunting this podcast. I feel like just every once in a while he comes up in a big way. And when you talk about war or weapons, you can't really escape him. Paul Virilio, for people who don't know, he was a French philosopher. Not even really. I don't know what you'd call him. He was a French guy who wrote books, and some people in philosophy have read them. He was also an architect and an advocate for homeless people in Paris, and a guy who was really into urban housing, just a wild character. But he famously had this kind of thesis that was sort of like a counter thesis to Marxism in a certain way. And it's actually a thesis that I find myself often being like, I don't know, maybe he's right. Who knows? But Marx famously thinks that history is moved forward by class struggle, right? There are these kind of economic classes, and no matter what situation you're in, whether it's capitalism or feudalism or something else, the kind of antagonisms of economic classes are what push society and history forward in these complicated ways. And so economic class is like a driving logic, you could say, to history. And Virilio, who also wants to be a certain kind of materialist, like he wants to think about how materiality drives history, he was like, well, there are logics that push history forward, but they're not economic at bottom. They're actually military logics. And he argues that the kind of dialectic between attack and defense, which relates to, how fast you can go or how well you can see an opponent, these kinds of things. That's really what drives our society forward. And probably there's a great like Marxist Virillian synthesis that somebody who is still in graduate school can make up. Definitely not me. But I think that there's something to it when Virilio talks about this, that like our societies are kind of like pushed forward in these almost irrational ways just by the sheer logic of war and military thinking. And man, when it comes to nuclear weapons, that feels so clear. Like the US and Russia, they both have over 5,000 nukes. Certainly there's a class element to that, right? Inheriting the class war in the Cold War and all these kinds of things. But there's also this kind of like totally irrational investment in like destructive forces rather than productive forces that is really significant and bizarre. And the key piece to Virilio's opposition to all this is that he's not only a peace activist, although he is that, he is also a Christian person. And in this book called Pure War, when he's talking about nukes, he says this, which I think is helpful. As a Christian, I reject nuclear faith. The believer in God protests against the divinity of the ultimate weapon. There they can talk of peace. They can call themselves pacifists in the name of a belief which opposes another idolatrous belief, the missile, no longer the Messiah. Man, that's as simple as that. there's a big idol, and it looks like a nuclear bomb, and then there's also a kind of Christian rejection of that idolatry. And man, Virilio, what a great guy who can actually figure it out.
I know. He just like lays it down, and he's correct. Yeah, there's something really interesting about theologizing it in this way. Liberals, conservatives alike, they will look at nuclear weapons and they'll think, yeah, it's a real tragedy that we have to have these big bad boys, but the bad guys have them, the good guys have them. That means that there's sort of a sense of mutually assured destruction. There's deterrence. There's a sense in which if everybody has these big bombs, then nobody will ever actually fire them because it would be too horrific, right? There's sort of like a sense in which they bring a type of like frozen over, not quite peace, something different. But Paul Virilio is right, acknowledging the idolatrous function of that a big destructive force like a nuclear bomb could actually bring a lasting sense of peace. I think is an interesting observation, and yeah, one that's counter to Christianity. There's another bit in this book. By the way, this book, it's such a wild. If you want to read about Paul Virilio, this is not the book to pick up. I don't know if there's a book that you could pick up if you wanted to read about him. This is I
have the opposite opinion. You can pick up literally any of them, and you'll get exactly as much out of it as any other one. You just have to start.
Maybe that's true. This book, Pure War, it is it's not like a book in the traditional sense. It is Paul Virilio's friend, this guy named Sylvain Lotringer, who is like just asking him questions, and they're sort of just like vibing about the answer to these questions. And it's fun to read, but it's not like a systematic philosophy book or something. It's not like you're not going to get like political theory out of it. You're going to get like two guys just kind of vibing, and Paul Virilio is going to say some like wild stuff that you can be like, yeah, that's awesome, and then that's kind of it, like what we just read here. Anyways, throughout this part of the book, Virilio thinks, man, the thing about Virilio is he's a person that like he lived through the occupation, like the Nazi occupation of France, and like has sort of like some firsthand experience with warfare in a way that's like shaped his brain in a productive way, but I'm sure it was really horrific. But he has a lot to say about this whole idea of deterrence and the type of peace that kind of brings. And something that he says later on in this like same kind of section where he's talking about the Messiah and the missile, two opposing forces, but two that also get confused for one another, I guess. He says that deterrence is a world where we're actually already dead, but we don't know it. And to get out of this world is not something that like a peace movement can do. It's kind of his is part of his conclusion. I think that like he's a pacifist, he's a peace activist, he's a person who is like involved in the world and like actively opposing things for sure. But to really walk things back, Paul Virilio says you need to do more than just like throw blood on a bomb or something, which I still think is great. But he says that you have to start actually considering death. That's his like concluding thought about deterrence. And it is kind of it's a great point, but it's a point that only really makes sense from the perspective of French philosophy. So I guess take it for what you will. Virilio basically thinks that, to oppose not just nuclear arms, but the whole regime of pure war, the whole thing, the whole society that's based on progression through destruction, we have to revive the question of death. And this is like a theological question for him, just as much as like a political question. And he says this: if we weren't mortal, there'd be no consciousness. If we were conscious, it's because we are mortal. Death and consciousness are allied. This is the consciousness of death. It's the origin of our consciousness. And this is a very fancy way of saying that, like, our lives without death don't have a lot of meaning, right? The sort of like limited scope on them produce a type of meaning. The whole idea of finitude introduces like a lot of things, a lot of self-reflection in life that you wouldn't have otherwise.
Yeah, I mean, I think that it's important, like, as it's like easy to write it off, I guess, as being kind of philosophizing your way out or
Yeah,
theologizing your way
overbearing.
out of the problem. Yeah. And, like, I guess there's probably something to that. But I also think that there's a sense of, I mean, okay, this is coming from a person who does have a PhD in philosophy, so I'll also take that for what it's worth. I have maybe some some of my own investment in this, but I think it does matter to sort of emphasize that, like, you have to really unplug from the apparatus of thinking, the ideologies that we're forced into to kind of taking on board in a society that's organized around exploitation and mass death, and like, that's not it. And I think that's what Christians often do, is they are satisfied with that piece, to be like, if I think differently about it, or if I go to church and we worship differently or whatever, then I'm kind of like, I've solved the problem in my head, and therefore the problem is solved in the world. Like, a lot of progressive Christians also do this. So, it can't be the end of it. But I do think that it's a sort of necessary step, right? Like, there's a kind of, I guess, reckoning with what the nuclear bomb, for example, means for us that is really significant. Maybe whenever I think the nuclear bomb, I also think of another philosopher who's not French. Don't worry, he's German. A guy named a guy named Peter Sloterdijk, and he has a really interesting bit on the nuclear bomb in a book he wrote called "The Critique of Cynical Reason," which I'm just going to read because I think it's also interesting and kind of stays with this theme of reflection. And then I'll see you, Matt, if you're convinced if we should think more about it. Okay. Sloterdijk says this. He says, the atomic bomb is the real Buddha of the West, a perfect sovereign apparatus without bonds. It rests unmoving in its silos, purest reality and purest possibility. It's the epitome of cosmic energies and human participation in these, the highest achievement of human beings and their destroyer, the triumph of technical rationality and its sublation. All right, skipping some more German stuff. He then goes on to say, although we built it to defend ourselves, it has in fact yielded for us a defenselessness without parallel. It's a consummation of the human in its evil aspect. We cannot get any more evil, intelligent, or defensive. The bomb is really the only Buddha that Western reason could understand. Its calm and its irony are infinite. It makes no difference to it how it fulfills its mission, whether in mute waiting or as a fire cloud. For it, the change of aggregate circumstance has no relevance. And he goes on to conclude, the only question that remains is whether we choose the external path or the inner path, whether insight will come from critical reflection or from the fireballs over the earth. And man, I think that is kind of putting it as starkly as it could be, right? Like, the bomb, a nuclear bomb, basically has two things that it can teach you just purely by existing. And either they will teach you that you should probably think about your death and not use things like nuclear bombs, or, it will be activated and it will teach you that nuclear bombs are very bad, and it will also teach you about death, but in an external way. And I think there's something to kind of saying that internal movement of reflection is really necessary to kind of, build out into also an external organized movement that's capable of, like, sustaining itself.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. Because with a nuclear bomb, or I guess any other type of like weapon of mass destruction, of mass death, nuclear bombs are bad, but there's plenty of other bombs that are like not nuclear that are bad too, I would say. I guess that's all I'm trying to say here.
Yeah.
But there's like there's something like particularly horrifying in the way that they completely erase like the meaning of death in a real way. This is maybe like overly philosophic and like maybe too romantic, but like death does mean something in someone's life, whether or not it's like, you're you're the monk in the bone church and you've lived like a particular holy life or whatever, or you tried to, and then you die and then you get put in the bone church. That means something, whether you, or if you like die in like armed, like face-to-face combat, that kind of death means something too in a way, there's like a a particular logic to it. There's a rationale to it, and maybe it's bad, but it does mean something, right? And if you like, I don't know, are a person with kids and you live a long, happy life with them, which I guess is probably the best most of us can ever hope for, and you die, and like there's something that type of death also means something. But mass death, especially nuclear weapons, it's like all of the symbolic value of that death, of like what it could mean to anybody else around you, is completely erased, because it's just like a big mass event that happens. And like, you know, a person who suffers it might not have any sort of stake in the war at all, or in the conflict at all. It could just be sort of like a big stupid accident that happens, which is like possible and has come close to happening in the recent history of nuclear weapons as well. So I don't know. It just the question of death seems like a big one to reflect on when it comes to mass death, because I don't know. You just end up in a weird situation where what does this actually mean? What are you doing? What are the repercussions? And like why is this like good for anybody? Why does anyone think this is like going to sort something out? A big question to ask yourself.
Yeah, I think so. And I think it's also worth kind of just figuring out again, like, I don't know, the 20th century is the discovery of mass death and mass killing, I guess is maybe a better way of putting it. And how to sort of not continue down that trajectory, to resist the logic that Virilio discovers, this kind of logic of like trying to outkill other people in other states, is a pretty tall order. And I think there's no way to resist that logic without trying to figure out, you know, what does it mean to take death seriously and in a kind of, you know, a peacemaking way. You know, something Virilio talks about that I think is also a good challenge to people on the left is that like Marxism, it doesn't really oppose the kind of war-making logic in and of itself, and in fact can spur it on. As we saw, Russia has lots of nukes as well left over from being a, you know, party to a certain kind of global class war. And I think there's a lot of complicated things to say about that, and also some limitations to how Virilio understands it. But he has a kind of critique of Marxism where he'll say like, you know, Marxism, you can like organize the workers at a factory, and that's very good. Like Virilio supports that for sure. But if the factory that they work at is like one that makes bombs, and at the end of the day, after the strike, they go back to making bombs, that would actually not be good. Like if they go back to making bombs with higher wages and better benefits, it would be bad that they did that. And I think there's something true about that, right? That like Marxism doesn't have a demilitarizing kind of moment in it, even though there's a kind of peace movement attached to it. And I think you need both, I guess, is what I'm saying. Like, I think they kind of correct one another. And at the end of the day, I don't know, reflecting on death is maybe one way of kind of like finding the the like common thread underneath Marxism and Virilio that we all have to be accountable to, that like one day people are going to die. And insofar as you shouldn't do that on purpose, we probably shouldn't be able to do that.
I feel like we don't have really any answers, but to consider death, and I think that's rough. Consider death, consider death, and build a Christian movement that can support people who are doing like peace work. I mean, that's the whole conversation seems absolutely stupid to have, because it's like, I don't know, there are 9 countries that produce nuclear weapons. There's a bunch of other countries that have them, and all this kind of stuff, right? It all seems very bad, and there's a sense in which like the whole global structure does seem dependent on nuclear weapons, and that is a stupid irrationality that I think we have to kind of start to overcome in our own brains, and then in our politics as well. In lieu of not really having any good answers to this other than thinking about death, I thought we could just maybe close out the episode with Bill Wiley Kellerman's Eucharist at Gunpoint, a reflection he had on being a part of the Plowshares movement. So here it is. When the pre-dawn moment came, we lit the Paschal candle and cut the barbed wire fence, breaking the seal of legal security and so proclaiming the resurrection, freedom from power of death. We had resolved and would eventually succeed in walking several miles of runway to the open gates of deadly force high security area filled with cruise missile armed B-52s. Our action turned out true and beautiful. The Spirit does not abandon us. Halfway down the runway, we renewed our baptismal vows, looking toward the bombers while renouncing Satan and all of his works. At the gate of the high security area, we spread the intercessory altar cloth, scattered vials of our blood in the name of the Lamb, and partook Eucharist at gunpoint, surrounded by military vehicles. Outside at churches in the front gatehouse, friends distributed our leaflet. We believe that human beings, so says Easter, are free from the power of death in all its forms and delivery systems. We are not in bondage to these weapons. We are truly and fully free to unmake them. Now, this very morning. We believe that God, who raised Christ from the dead, will also quicken our imaginations and thereby our bodies and lives. We believe this is the meaning of the resurrection. Or so we had discerned. Thanks be to God.
Thanks for listening to the Magnificast. If you like what you heard, you can support us on Patreon at patreon.com/the Magnificast. If you do that, you can join our Discord and you can spend a little bit of your time when you're not dust talking with other people who are not yet dust about all kinds of different things. People are reading Capital Volume 1 together pretty soon, thanks to some really good organizing by folks in the Discord, and you can get on board if you want to read that book with other people. Our music's by Amari Armstrong, our outro's by The Illogical Spoon, and we'll see you next week.
I don't wanna get up for church in the morning, souls alive. Heaven come to earth and there won't be no church. We'll meet down by the riverside. There we'll swim with all creation. Never get tired, never bored. Don't worry, someday there'll be no dam between us and our Lord. Jackson, keep your hoods up. Keep your hoods up and you stay up late. In Jackson, you keep your hoods up. Well, you keep your hoods up and you stay up late. Oh, don't mind a cold night, but we might mind if you leave too soon. So come on now, it's still early. At least what else are you gonna do? As we kissed in the alley by the Michigan Theater, fall snow was glowing in the lights of the downtown. Saw a spark in your eyes, I just spoke it. Said we're gonna turn this whole place upside down. Then you said, my dear, do you really mean this? I said, I only know what I feel right now. I said, poets lie, sometime come true. Stay away from me, where see what we can do. Poets lie, sometime come true. Stay away from me, where see what we can do in my town. I don't wanna get up for church in the morning, souls alive. Heaven come to earth and there won't be no church. We'll meet down by the riverside. There we'll swim with all creation. Never get tired, never bored. Don't worry, someday there'll be no dam between us and our Lord. Jackson,